In the heart of a forsaken world, amidst desolate cliffs and endless barren landscapes, the warrior known as Karvak took another ragged breath. Every inhale stung his chest, a reminder that his body was weakening, though his spirit refused to crumble. They had left him here, every last one of them. The allies he once defended, the leaders who praised his name, even his own people, all had abandoned him. They had looked at him, this living legend, and decided he was no longer of value. That he, the Iron Shadow, was better off erased. Karvak had given decades of his life to his people, the Morvani. He was the first into battle, the one who rallied them when all seemed lost, the one they relied on to protect and serve without question. To them, he was a hero, or so he thought. In the brutal struggle for power and territory, they had once needed his strength, his tactical mind. He fought for honor, never wavering, because he believed in something larger than himself. But in the end, loyalty had been his undoing. War had come again, but this time, alliances were shifting faster than the tides. One battle had melded into the next, a haze of endless violence where friends and foes became indistinguishable. In the thick of it, Karvak held his ground, refusing to retreat even as his forces dwindled. He kept fighting, kept pushing, until a well-placed strike felled him. As he lay there, blood pooling around him, he remembered thinking they'd come for him. His people, his allies, surely, someone would come. But they didn't. He'd been left lying in that battlefield, a casualty deemed unworthy of recovery. When he awoke, wounded and alone, he realized the bitter truth. He was a symbol, a relic, something his people were no longer willing to uphold. In a twisted calculation, they had judged his survival to be less valuable than his absence. Maybe they thought he'd be a legend, a martyr they could use to fuel stories of sacrifice. Perhaps they believed that leaving him behind would bring shame to his enemies while still serving their interests. Whatever the reason, they left him there, unclaimed, a fallen warrior abandoned to rot. It was weeks now, perhaps months, he couldn't be sure. The days blurred, each as bleak as the last. Food was scarce, water even more so. The harsh winds cut through him like knives, but he endured. Pride alone kept him moving. He couldn't help but wonder, was this what they had seen in him, a worn, exhausted soldier with nothing left to give? Was he, too, blind to his own obsolescence? He scrounged for resources, making a makeshift shelter in the hollow of an ancient tree. Nights were the worst. The cold seeped deep, clawing at his bones, and the silence was relentless. In the absence of comrades, of purpose, his mind played cruel games, reminding him of his greatest victories and forcing him to question if they'd ever truly mattered. For the first time in his life, he felt small, insignificant, a mere speck in the endless expanse of the universe. The mighty Iron Shadow, the warrior of legends, was just another being left to fade. But even as despair gnawed at him, he resisted surrender. His body may have been battered and worn, but his pride as a Morvani warrior refused to let him simply fade away. If he were to die, he would die standing, his spirit unbroken. And so he moved each day, slow and painful as it was, refusing to yield to the grim fate laid out for him by those he had once trusted. Yet, as strong as his pride was, the longing for rescue remained. Each sunset, as the sky blazed in hues of red and orange, he would find himself staring into the horizon, willing some ship, any ship, to break through the clouds and bring him home. But there was only silence, and in that silence, he came to understand what he truly was to them. Not a warrior, not a hero, but a tool they had discarded the moment he ceased to serve their purpose. So, he pushed on, day after day, waiting for the end, yet fighting it all the same. There was no audience here, no one to witness his suffering or remember his name. He was alone, with only his thoughts and the fading echoes of battles long past. But still, he held to a single, stubborn truth. If he could survive a little longer, then maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over. The faint hum of energy crackled across the barren wasteland as a human exploration vessel descended, dust spiraling into the air. The crew, an unlikely mix of explorers and scientists, moved with purpose, eyes scanning their equipment and the landscape with a practiced gaze. They were here because of a strange energy signal, a faint pulse that flickered in and out, like a heartbeat struggling to stay alive. Whatever caused it, they hoped it would be worth the journey to this forgotten world. Their mission was clear: investigate, document, and if possible, recover whatever alien technology might be hidden here. As they spread out, combing the area, one of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Ellis, caught sight of a faint movement in the distance. Against the stark landscape, it was barely noticeable, a shadow shifting near a rugged outcrop. She signaled to the others, and they moved cautiously, alert but curious. The signal they picked up seemed stronger here, and whatever lay ahead was the source. The figure came into view slowly, almost blending into the twisted landscape around it. Ragged, battle-scarred, and almost skeletal in appearance, he was barely standing. His skin, tough and gray from countless battles, was stretched over lean muscle, worn from weeks, maybe months, of isolation. They recognized him immediately, despite his condition. The stories of the Iron Shadow, Karvak, had traveled far and wide across the galaxy. For most, he was a legend, a warrior whose valor and skill were unmatched. But the figure before them now was barely a shadow of that legend. Yet, even in his weakened state, his eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding pride. The humans approached carefully, trying to communicate that they meant no harm. But Karvak's gaze was hard, suspicious. He stood as straight as he could, though it was clear every movement cost him effort. He was a warrior, not a beggar, and the last thing he wanted was pity. As they came closer, Ellis noticed the tension in his stance, the way his hands clenched as if ready for an attack, though it was obvious he could hardly stand. They could sense his pride, the layers of dignity and defiance that held him upright even as his body fought to give out. One of the humans, a medic named Ryan, offered water, moving slowly so as not to seem threatening. Karvak looked at the outstretched hand with disdain, as if taking it would somehow shatter the last piece of his dignity. But his parched throat betrayed him, and after a moment's hesitation, he accepted, though his eyes remained wary. He sipped slowly, each drop a reminder of how long he had gone without aid, without even the faintest sign of compassion. The humans, seeing his resistance to help, understood. They didn't press, didn't crowd him. They worked with quiet respect, offering supplies and medical assistance in small gestures, waiting for him to accept on his own terms. Karvak couldn't deny the effectiveness of their approach. They respected his pride, understood his need to keep his honor intact. And that, he realized, was something he hadn't expected from these humans. Other species would have mocked him or treated him like a broken relic. But these humans, they treated him as a warrior, no less deserving of respect simply because he was wounded and alone. Over the next few hours, as the humans continued their work, he allowed himself to study them. They moved with a strange rhythm, a quiet efficiency that was foreign to him yet oddly impressive. Their actions seemed driven not by orders or duty alone, but by something more, empathy, a quality he thought long dead in the galaxy's cold politics. Ellis, noticing his silent observation, began to share stories of their own battles and struggles. She talked of humanity's history, the countless times they had faced extinction and fought their way back. She spoke of resilience, of the value they placed on loyalty and honor. And as Karvak listened, he found himself oddly drawn to their tales. They spoke not of power or conquest but of survival, of protecting each other against impossible odds. He found it difficult to understand at first. His people valued strength above all else, and weakness was met with disdain. Yet, here were these humans, treating weakness as something to be met with kindness, as if supporting one another was the very foundation of their strength. As night fell, they gathered around a small fire, the humans sharing their rations with him. Though he ate sparingly, each bite was a stark reminder of how long he had gone without. And as he sat among them, listening to their quiet conversations and laughter, he felt a strange warmth, a sense of camaraderie that he hadn't known he missed. It was a stark contrast to the cold abandonment he'd suffered, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the universe, there were still beings who valued loyalty, who held on to their honor no matter the cost. By the time the fire had died down, Karvak found himself wondering if perhaps he had misjudged these humans. They were not what he'd expected. They did not seek glory or control. They were here, risking their lives simply to help him, a forgotten warrior whose name had faded from the annals of galactic fame. And for the first time since his abandonment, he felt a faint spark of hope, a fragile, unfamiliar feeling that perhaps, despite everything, he had not been forgotten entirely. As dawn broke over the barren landscape, Karvak and the humans were jolted from their rest by a sudden, unnatural sound, a low, guttural roar that echoed through the desolate valley. Shadows moved against the rocks, too fast and too many to count. The humans and Karvak exchanged a look, a silent understanding settling between them. They were under attack. From the dim light emerged a swarm of creatures, their forms adapted to the harsh, unforgiving land, with sharp claws and gleaming eyes that marked them as efficient predators. The humans fell into defensive positions, each one moving instinctively, covering one another as they had done countless times before. Karvak watched them for a moment, their precision and coordination surprising him. These humans, seemingly fragile and unequipped, displayed a level of trust and synergy that felt familiar. It stirred something in him, an old instinct to protect, to fight alongside those he trusted. And against his better judgment, he found himself stepping forward, joining their formation, bracing for the onslaught. When the creatures lunged, Karvak's instincts took over, his reflexes honed by years of combat kicking in. He moved swiftly, his body remembering each tactic, each strike, even as his muscles protested from fatigue. Next to him, Ellis fought fiercely, her movements calculated, precise, as she fended off a creature that had managed to break through their line. Another human was cornered, trying to fend off two attackers at once, and before Karvak could think twice, he surged forward, taking down one of the beasts with a quick strike, allowing the human to recover. They fought side by side, humans and alien, their backs against each other, a strange alliance formed out of necessity. Karvak's mind raced as he defended them, wondering why he was risking himself for them, creatures he had once viewed as weak, as mere onlookers in the galaxy's larger battles. But as they fought together, he realized these humans fought not out of obligation but out of loyalty, an unbreakable code that bound them to one another. Each one covered the other's back, each one stood firm, never leaving anyone behind. The battle raged on, and though fatigue clawed at him, Karvak felt something he hadn't in ages, a renewed purpose. For the first time since his abandonment, he wasn't fighting alone. There was something liberating, even exhilarating, about knowing there were others he could rely on, others who wouldn't abandon him at the first sign of weakness. He fought with a strength that surprised even himself, a sense of vigor rekindled by the human's presence. Eventually, the creatures retreated, leaving the ground littered with remnants of the struggle. As the dust settled, Karvak looked around at the humans, catching his breath. Ellis nodded at him, a gesture of mutual respect. There was no need for words, the fight had said everything. They protected each other, survived together, and in that silent understanding, Karvak felt the first real sense of belonging he had felt in years. The humans moved to treat each other's wounds, and though they extended their care to him, Karvak initially waved them off, clinging to his pride. But they insisted, reminding him that in their code, no one was left unattended. And so, reluctantly, he allowed them to tend to his injuries. As they worked, he found himself silently grateful. These were not gestures of pity, they were acts of solidarity. He realized he was being accepted not as a charity case but as a member of their group. Each touch, each word of reassurance, reminded him of what he'd once fought for, of what he'd lost in the endless political games that had abandoned him here. In the quiet that followed, they sat together, weary but undefeated. The humans shared their rations again, and this time, Karvak accepted them without hesitation. He could see now that their strength wasn't in sheer power or fearlessness but in their ability to stand together, to protect each other without question. It was something he'd forgotten, a bond that transcended species, something pure, untainted by the betrayals and shifting allegiances of the galaxy. Ellis spoke softly, her words weaving through the silence as she told Karvak about the struggles humanity had faced, about their determination to hold on to hope even when abandoned, even when the odds were stacked against them. And as he listened, something within him softened. He saw a kind of resilience in them, a spirit that resonated with the warrior within him, the one that had refused to die even in the darkest moments. He glanced at each of them, these humans who had given him more than just aid. They had given him a reason to fight again, a purpose he hadn't realized he'd lost. And in that moment, he understood that he would protect them with everything he had, just as they had protected him. They had shown him a loyalty that transcended race, that honored him not as a relic or a weapon but as a being worth fighting for. As night fell once more, Karvak knew that his path had shifted. No longer was he the forgotten warrior, abandoned to die alone. Here, in the company of humans, he had found a new purpose, a reason to stand and fight that went beyond his own survival. These humans had shown him something he hadn't believed in anymore, a bond built on trust, on loyalty, a bond he would honor with his life if necessary. The following morning, as they gathered their supplies, a faint energy pulse blinked on the human scanners, stronger this time, drawing everyone's attention. It was nearby, emanating from an outcrop of rocks, almost like a beacon calling to them. Karvak, drawn by curiosity and the humans' resolve, followed as they approached the source, moving carefully over the rough terrain until they reached the base of a jagged cliff. Buried beneath layers of stone and sand, they found a metallic structure, ancient and partly concealed. With some coordinated effort, they uncovered it further, revealing a relic from an old age, a hidden weapon, a device so powerful it pulsed with contained energy, its presence masked by the harsh landscape. Ellis and the others exchanged worried looks, recognizing what it was, an artifact powerful enough to alter entire planetary systems, a secret some would kill to obtain or keep hidden. Karvak felt a chill run through him. He had seen similar devices in his time, weapons too dangerous to be wielded by anyone, let alone left hidden, waiting to be found by the wrong hands. And then, in a moment of clarity, he understood. The leaders who had abandoned him had likely known about this artifact. They had likely orchestrated his demise not out of indifference but to silence him, to keep him far from uncovering their plans. To them, he had been a threat, a loyal warrior with too much honor to turn a blind eye to their schemes. The betrayal stung deeper than he had thought possible. He had been a pawn, discarded to cover up their greed. Yet here he was, not as their weapon but as a survivor, standing with those who had risked their lives to save him. The humans might not have known what they were getting into, but their courage was undeniable. They were here for no personal gain, only because they had seen a life worth saving. Ellis looked at Karvak, her expression resolute. She asked if this artifact was worth dying for, her voice carrying a quiet conviction. She didn't flinch or step back, and in that moment, he saw that they weren't asking him to fight or sacrifice himself, they wanted his guidance, his expertise. They trusted him. They were asking him not as a tool, but as an equal. He felt a strange surge of loyalty, a fierce determination to protect them, to make sure they weren't pulled into a conflict that wasn't theirs. But more than that, he wanted justice, not revenge, but a reckoning for those who had betrayed him and everything he stood for. He looked at the artifact, then back at the humans, and for the first time, he felt a sense of peace about his decision. These humans had shown him more honor in days than his own kind had shown him in a lifetime. Without hesitation, he offered his loyalty, pledging to stand with them. The humans accepted, not with grand speeches or ceremony, but with a quiet nod, a shared understanding that they were in this together. They knew the risks but chose to face them as one, without expectation of reward or glory. It was simple, raw, and more powerful than any allegiance he'd known. As they moved to leave, Karvak took one last look at the artifact, knowing that with it exposed, his people and their allies would likely come looking. They'd follow the energy signals, drawn by the lure of power, and they would find him standing in defense of those who had given him a second chance. And for the first time in ages, he felt alive, fueled not by a need to prove himself or to fulfill a duty, but by a loyalty born of shared struggle and unspoken trust. Back aboard their ship, they took off, leaving the desolate planet behind. But this time, Karvak wasn't leaving alone. He looked around at the humans, his new allies, and felt a fierce pride. He wasn't just a warrior for his people anymore. He was a warrior for those who had stood by him when no one else would. And he knew, as they flew into the stars, that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where he fought not out of obligation, but out of loyalty, bound to the humans who had saved his life and restored his honor. In the vast, endless expanse of space, Karvak had found his place once more, not as a forgotten relic, but as a part of something greater. And this time, he knew, he would never be abandoned.